After a year or so of covering this new president and this new administration, I have found in general that it is always a safer bet to report on what they're doing rather than what they're saying. On this show, we sort of have a staff mantra about this: a silent movie. That's the rule. Treat them as a silent movie. Just watch what they do, not what they say. And, you know, all good rules have their exceptions. But I think what we're seeing right now in the wake of what happened in Parkland, Florida, is an example of why that rule has some weight. After the massacre in Parkland, you may have seen that this is part of what the president said should be done in response. The president said online, we must now focus on strengthening background checks for people who want to buy guns. That's what he has said. LA Times job rounding up of what the president has actually done on that subject since he's been in office. Again, saying versus doing. Since President Trump took office, his administration has moved aggressively on multiple fronts to weaken the background check system for guns. The Trump administration has narrowed the legal definitions that define someone as ineligible to buy a gun. Narrowing those definitions means more people are eligible to buy guns. One way to be disqualified from buying a gun is if you are a fugitive from justice, right? That makes sense. If you're wanted by the law, you shouldn't be able to buy a gun under those circumstances. But the FBI used to consider people fugitives from justice if there were outstanding warrants for their arrest. Now, thanks to the Trump administration and its changes, a fugitive from justice will only be disqualified from buying a gun if he or she has also fled across state lines to intentionally avoid prosecution. If you haven't done that, then they don't consider you a fugitive from justice anymore for the purposes of the background check. Trump administration has also just thrown out tens of thousands of law enforcement records that used to be included in the background check system. Certain forms and aspects of mental illness also used to disqualify you from buying a gun in the background check system. The Trump administration has narrowed those mental illness definitions. And, somewhat famously, in the first substantive standalone legislation that was passed by the new Republican Congress and signed by new President Trump, they overtly went out of their way in standalone legislation to change the law so people who have been adjudicated seriously mentally ill by the Social Security Administration, they're no longer included in the background check system at all. And if that wasn't enough, quote, in his recently released budget for the coming fiscal year, President Trump proposed slashing millions of dollars from the budget for the background check system. So that is what they are doing. Right? Those are their actions, which is very important to know when you see that same president saying what he really wants to do is strengthen the background check system. That narrative from him and those actions by him, they don't tell two conflicting stories. They tell one story. They tell the story of what he's doing while he wants to convince you otherwise. Now, the president also made headlines last night when he said he would ask the Justice Department to consider regulations regarding bump stocks, one of these aftermarket modifications you can strap onto your semi-automatic rifle to make it fire so fast it essentially functions like a machine gun. The president's remarks on that subject made headlines, but you should know that in terms of what he actually asked to happen, he requested the Justice Department to come up with regulations around these. Well, the Justice Department has already considered regulating those kinds of devices. Dianne Feinstein, the author of the Clinton-era assault rifle ban, which was allowed to expire during the George W. Bush years, today she released this letter from 5 years ago, reminding everyone that Democrats have been asking for years for DOJ to promulgate regulations to stop these add-ons and accessories that make semi-automatic rifles fire like they're automatic. The Justice Department is already on record explicitly saying that they are not allowed legally to promulgate those kinds of regulations. It is not within their power. Congress has to do it. So if the president wants to ban bump stocks or trigger cranks or any of these other accessories, there is definitely a way to do it. It's clear. Almost assuredly, the only way to do it is to ask the Congress, which is controlled by his party, to pass a law that would ban those things. But despite the headlines from last night that the president has directed action against those accessories, there's no signs of any legislation request coming from the White House, and there's no sign that the Republican-controlled Congress plans to do that. So, I mean, it's always a good rule, but at times like this, maybe more than ever, watch what they're doing and not what they're saying. That said, maybe none of us really knows what's going to happen down the road here. Because maybe all kids protesting after the Parkland massacre are going to change everything. Look at all these kids. Look at the funerals of all of these kids. Look at Florida lawmakers visiting the school in Parkland, Florida, where this massacre happened. And these Florida kids bringing themselves to the legislature today, where they were an unavoidable force. Again, the Miami Herald calling this today the biggest demonstration at the state capitol in Florida in decades. And also at the White House, yes, watch what they do and not what they say, but also look at what is being said to this president. There was this awkward photo today from the Associated Press showing the notes that the president brought with him to talk to these kids and their families who have been through gun massacres in recent years. You can see number 5 there is telling the president to say, "I hear you." But even with notes to help him know what to say, and even with the best of intentions, and even with the softest heart, I think it is hard to predict what happens to people and how it changes people when they have to face this kind of grief in person. When you're in the presence of this